Every day we face countless risks. Some merely cause us to stumble, but others are powerful enough to drag an entire society into the abyss. These are no longer isolated incidents, but have become mega-threat slow but relentless waves shaking the very foundations of the world. Nuriel Roubini's book, Megathreats*, is not a collection of pessimistic, random predictions, but a detailed map of 10 dangerous trends simultaneously taking shape. From ballooning public debt, aging populations, and climate change to out-of-control technology and the disintegration of international order. All are interwoven, amplifying each other, making every escape route narrower. But the biggest question isn't whether these threats exist. We see them daily. The question is whether we are capable of changing our trajectory, or if this generation will be the one to witness the end of a 7-decade cycle of stability, giving way to an unprecedented era of chaos. Part 1: Debt, Demographics, and Dangerous Policies. I have lived through many debt crises, observing from both sides as an academic and as a policymaker directly involved. After 4 decades, one thing I've learned is that people consistently repeat their mistakes. When euphoria soars, money is pumped in, credit standards are lowered, and bubbles are created. When the bubble bursts, the whole world shakes. Argentina is a familiar example. In 2020, the country defaulted for the 9th time in its history. Promises from leaders that it wouldn't happen again sounded so familiar they became a refrain. They thanked the Pope, world leaders, and everyone for helping to extend terms and cut interest rates. But in reality, the country was still drowning in $300 billion of public debt, with inflation exceeding 50%. These numbers indicate they were far from escaping. What's more terrifying is that the entire world is becoming Argentina. Public debt, private debt, household debt, corporate debt, all are ballooning out of control. In the US, COVID relief packages alone added over $4.5 trillion to public debt. In Europe, debt-to-GDP ratios have returned to levels unseen since World War II. By the end of 2021, total global debt exceeded 350% of world GDP. That figure isn't just a statistic, it's a death knell for growth. If this trend continues, the Institute of International Finance predicts that by 2030, global debt will surpass $360 trillion, equivalent to more than 4 times global economic output. This is the seed of the most terrible debt crisis in history. The problem isn't just the scale, but the method asterisk. Debt for consumption differs from debt for investment. A country borrowing to build ports, roads, and bridges can create long-term benefits. But when borrowing to cover chronic deficits to sustain insatiable spending, the outcome is almost certainly collapse. Historically, we've witnessed enough. The Dutch tulip mania, Japan's real estate bubble, the Asian financial crisis, the Latin American debt crisis, the US market collapse in 2008. But this time is different. This time, every sector, public, private, individual, is awash in debt, and as interest rates rise, that resilience will shatter. I warned about the US real estate bubble in 2006, while everyone scoffed and called me Dr. Doom. A few years later, when the entire system collapsed, they called me a prophet. But I was never happy to be right, because all I saw was tragedy: abandoned homes, families losing everything, financial markets in turmoil. Now I see those same signs repeating, but on a larger scale. A global debt tsunami is rising. Once again, we trap ourselves in the old cycle: blind optimism, spending borrowed money, waiting for a miracle that never comes. Meanwhile, many nations still eagerly borrow in foreign currency to enjoy low interest rates, only to fall into the currency mismatch trap. When the domestic currency depreciates, the debt suddenly doubles. That's the trap that once crushed Argentina, and now it stalks many emerging economies. I call the coming scenario the mother of all debt crises. It's no longer a distant forecast. It has already begun, from poor African nations drowning in debt and poverty to economic giants like the US, China, and Europe. All are stuck. No one is immune. Observing this, I realize the problem isn't just the size of the debt, but the failure of both the private and public sectors. These failures don't just repeat, they self-amplify, creating a dangerous spiral. Governments often intervene to rescue when a crisis erupts, but incorrect bailouts only transform private debt into public debt. Zombie companies, those that survive by borrowing new money to pay old debts are pumped with more oxygen. The result is a system increasingly filled with financial zombies, contributing nothing to growth while draining resources. Look at the doom loop in Europe from 2010 to 2015, where weak banks were rescued by public debt, causing governments to fall into debt crises. Then, weak governments dragged down banks holding national bonds. Both were entangled, like two prey bound to the same rock, sinking together. Measures seemingly designed to cure, such as fiscal stimulus or inflationary debt erasure, come with harsh consequences. Austerity can easily push society into a deep recession. Printing money to erase debt evaporates the savings of an entire generation. Excessive fiscal stimulus, as seen during COVID-19, sparks inflation. There was a time when people believed in modern monetary theory, a doctrine suggesting governments could print unlimited money for spending. But experience shows it's nothing but a game of pay today, pay tomorrow. What seemed like solutions become factors fueling the worst debt crisis in history. Meanwhile, at a deeper level, social structures are changing. The world is entering a slow-motion demographic bomb. In Japan, Europe, and South Korea, birth rates have fallen to unprecedented lows. An aging population means a shrinking workforce, while the burden of pensions and healthcare balloons. Imagine a society where more elderly people need care than young people are capable of working. Social welfare budgets are drained, taxes must increase, and growth is eroded. This is a silent catastrophe, not as noisy as a financial crisis, but with equally devastating long-term consequences. While the population declines, another paradox unfolds: cheap money. For years, low and even negative interest rates in Europe and Japan created an illusion. Debt was no longer dangerous. Governments borrowed more easily, businesses borrowed more easily, and individuals borrowed more easily. But when everything booms thanks to cheap money, the price to pay is a bubble. Real estate bubbles, stock market bubbles, crypto bubbles, all are products of the cheap money era. When bubbles inflate, prosperity seems real. When they burst, everything collapses simultaneously. And ultra-loose monetary policy is not just a painkiller, it's a high-dose poison. History has proven the boom-bust cycle repeats. 17th century tulips in Holland, 1929 stocks, Japan's real estate, the dot-com bubble. In the early 21st century, US housing, and now we see bubbles spreading globally. All these pieces are leading to a chilling scenario: stagflation. Unlike normal recessions, stagflation is the worst combination. Stagnant growth, high unemployment, while inflation still soars. That was the scenario of the 1970s, but this time it's far more dangerous. Because of the global debt tsunami, because of the demographic bomb, because of the cheap money trap. We've used up our ammunition. Monetary and fiscal policies have little room left. And when a major shock appears, be it war, pandemic, or energy crisis, the fragile system will shake like a house of cards. The future is no longer simply about short economic cycles followed by recovery. What lies ahead is like a prolonged storm where megathreats intertwine, creating a domino effect. Imagine a global debt tsunami sweeping through, causing businesses to go bankrupt, banks to falter, and governments unable to pay interest. Simultaneously, the demographic bomb explodes slowly, shrinking the workforce. Healthcare and social welfare systems are overwhelmed. At that point, monetary policy, already dependent on cheap money, becomes ineffective. When inflation erupts due to energy costs, food prices, and extreme climate, central banks are forced to raise interest rates. But raising interest rates also means making the debt burden unbearable. And so, stagflation appears. The economy stagnates while prices still rise, with no soft landing. In such a situation, people often cling to the illusion that technology will save us. But let's face the truth: technology is not a magic bullet. Artificial intelligence can boost productivity, but it can also eliminate millions of jobs. Cryptocurrency, once hailed as digital gold, ultimately revealed itself to be a cheap money bubble, evaporating trillions of dollars in just a few months. We've grown accustomed to a post-war order where growth was steady, prosperity increased, and major wars between great powers didn't happen. But that foundation is cracking. New generations are no longer sure they will live better than their parents. Piled-up debt, cheap money turned toxic, an aging population, and stagflation lurking, all paint a picture vastly different from what humanity has experienced in the past 75 years. I call this the new age of instability. And the scary thing is, it doesn't come alone. Each threat reinforces the others. When stagflation occurs, social discontent surges, leading to populism and nationalism. Governments then easily fall into demagogic policies, excessive spending, protectionist barriers, printing money to appease the populace. But that only adds fuel to the fire. There's a truth few want to admit. The global economy has entered a zone where familiar exits no longer exist. The tools that once helped us overcome crises, lower interest rates, increased spending, expanded trade have now become double-edged swords. Lower interest rates further, bubbles inflate. Increase spending further, public debt explodes. Expand trade, face waves of protectionism and geopolitical conflict. Even economic giants like the US, China, and Europe cannot be confident they stand outside this spiral. China carries a massive mountain of private debt, especially in real estate. US public debt has exceeded historical levels. Europe still grapples with the ghosts of old debt crises. All signs indicate that the mother of all debt crises is not just a hypothesis, but a rapidly approaching reality. And when it strikes, the consequences will not just be numbers on a statistical table. It will be jobs lost, widespread poverty, families plunged into despair, nations sliding into political instability. Humans tend to be optimistic. We think that no matter the difficulties, things will eventually return to how they were. Crisis followed by recovery, bubbles followed by new booms. But this time is different. When the global debt tsunami combines with the demographic bomb, cheap money, and stagflation, it's no longer a cycle but a turning point. And this turning point will determine whether we retain the stability we've enjoyed for 3/4 of a century, or slide into an era of chaos where each shock multiplies into many others. As I look at the global picture, I see clearly that what's unfolding is not just a series of separate economic events, but a tightening web of interconnected dangers. The global debt tsunami is not alone. It shakes the entire financial system, exposing the failures of both public and private policy. The banking system, once considered a pillar of safety, is now the most vulnerable. As cheap money flowed abundantly, banks financed countless risky projects from real estate and technology to unsustainable consumer loans. The result is that when interest rates reverse, these debts explode like time bombs simultaneously. Businesses fare no better. Many companies survive by continuous borrowing, lacking real productivity. These zombie companies absorb capital but create no value. And when a crisis erupts, governments continue to bail them out, not to revive them, but merely to postpone their death. That is the tragedy. Taxpayer money is thrown into endless black holes. Meanwhile, on a societal level, the demographic bomb ticks every second. Japan is the clearest example: a rapidly aging population, low birth rates, and decades of economic stagnation. Europe is not exempt from this rule. Even China, once proud of its immense workforce, now faces population decline. As populations age, labor productivity falls, healthcare costs rise, and welfare burdens exceed affordability. In this context, those who once believed in a model of doing less, receiving more, are beginning to realize it's no longer sustainable. Pension systems, based on the principle of younger generations paying for older ones, now collapse as the number of elderly outstrips the young. No miracle can fill that gap. Then there's the cheap money trap. It has been maintained for too long, from Nixon detaching the dollar from gold to quantitative easing after 2008. The world has become increasingly accustomed to the idea that printing more money is the solution to every problem. But the more accustomed we become, the more fragile the system becomes, like an addict. Each dose of painkiller only increases the pain later. Evidence is clear from meme stocks, like GameStop, where small retail investors borrowed money to bet on an illusionary game, to cryptocurrencies, where millions believed they held the financial future. The outcome is the evaporation of countless assets, leaving countless investors empty-handed, burdened with debts they cannot repay. The truth is, cryptocurrency is neither currency nor a safe asset. At the same time, the major structures of the global financial system also face challenges. The USD, the #1 reserve currency for decades, is beginning to be challenged. Countries, especially emerging economies, do not want to rely too heavily on the dollar. They hoard gold, turn to the yuan, the euro, or even build bilateral payment mechanisms. If confidence in the dollar weakens, the consequences will not be limited to the US, but will shake the entire global trade and financial system. Then there's the EMU, the European Monetary Union. The idea of a common currency for dozens of countries sounded appealing when it was first introduced. But in reality, the combination of common monetary policy and separate fiscal policies has revealed too many contradictions. The Greek sovereign debt crisis was just a warning. If a larger country like Italy or Spain falls into crisis and is forced to leave the euro, that crack could collapse the entire structure. This is a dangerous picture. From technological innovations like CBDCs and fintech to risky experiments with cryptocurrencies, from the dominant power of the USD being questioned to the potential fragmentation of the EMU, all form a recipe for monetary chaos and financial instability. Part 2: Financial, Trade, Geopolitical, Technological, and Environmental Disasters. If new financial technologies only make the system fragile, then political and geopolitical changes can turn that fragility into real chaos, because when currency falters, nowhere is safe. There was a time when globalization was seen as an irreversible flow. In the years after the Cold War, countries lowered trade barriers, opened markets, and signed numerous free trade agreements. Supply chains stretched across the world, goods were produced where costs were low, and sold everywhere cheaply. Consumers benefited, businesses expanded, and growth was steady. That was the golden age of globalization. But now that picture is cracking. Many scholars and politicians question whether we are witnessing the end of globalization, or at least an era of slowbalization, where global flows slow down, fragment, and become more political than economic. The COVID-19 pandemic was the first blow, revealing the fragility of supply chains. When China locked down, the whole world lacked masks, medical equipment, then semiconductors, electronic components. Just one link blocked, and the entire global production chain ground to a halt. From then on, governments began to think about self-reliance, not wanting to hand over control to a distant nation or region. Then came the US-China trade war. Tariffs, investment restrictions, technology controls, all unleashed not just for economic reasons, but for national security. From this, the trend of reshoring, bringing production back home, became common. And for sectors where domestic production was too expensive, countries chose friendshoring, trading only with trusted allies. The result is a world gradually dividing into blocks instead of a unified global market. We witness the rise of regional agreements in North America, Asia-Pacific pacts, and the European Union tightening internally. Each bloc seeks to protect its own supply chains, but this very act sacrifices the economies of scale that once fueled globalization. This change isn't just about trade, it's also about productivity. When production fragments, costs increase, efficiency decreases, goods become more expensive, profits shrink, and growth slows. In a world accustomed to abundant flows of goods, now every disruption becomes a price shock. It's also important to remember that globalization isn't just about goods, but also capital flows, people, and data. As tensions rise, cross-border investment decreases, labor migration becomes more difficult, and data is tightly controlled. A world once connected by the global internet is now gradually fragmenting into national and regional digital spaces. So is this the complete end of globalization? Probably not, because the world economy is still too intertwined for a definitive divorce. But clearly, the era of unconditional openness has ended. We are entering a phase of slowbalization, where global connections slow, become conditional, and are often politically driven. The question is, in such a fragmented world, what is the future of growth? Can nations maintain prosperity without relying on a vast global market? Or will we accept living in a less efficient but politically safer era? The end of globalization is no longer an academic hypothesis. It is happening every day, with every decision, every barrier erected. And each step profoundly changes how the world produces, trades, and even how people understand their interconnectedness. When humans invented the steam engine, we knew it could replace muscle power. When electricity and mass production lines appeared, humans realized machines could work faster, more accurately, and cheaper. But in every previous revolution, there was still a place for humans' intellect, creativity, judgment. Now with AI, everything changes. AI and robotics are no longer just tools, they have begun to do most jobs better than humans. From financial data analysis to medical diagnosis, from customer service to driving, from writing reports to creating art. Segments of work once considered human prerogatives are gradually being replaced. The biggest fear is not that technology fails, but that it succeeds too much. Once AI can work 24/7, needing no rest, demanding no salary, getting no sickness, what business will want to pay millions of employees? This replacement isn't happening only in simple, repetitive jobs. It's spreading to high-skill industries. The consequence is a new social stratification. A small group of people who own technology, data, capital, and special skills will reap enormous profits. The majority will lose jobs, income, and, most importantly, dignity. Inequality, already a disease in many economies, will become more profound than ever. In this scenario, despair can turn into anger. Millions, hundreds of millions of people excluded from the labor market will not sit idly by. They will question, resist, seek explanations, and blame. And history shows that when anger is rampant, politics shifts towards extremism. The risk is even greater in terms of ethics and identity. As AI becomes smarter, the question is not just whether we can control it, but whether we retain our central position in society. In extreme scenarios, people even consider human-robot hybrids, integrating technology into their own bodies and brains to avoid being left behind. Is that the inevitable future? Perhaps no one is sure. But what is clear is that AI is not just an invention. It is a challenge to the very concepts of work and value that human society has built over thousands of years. When machines can write poetry, compose music, paint, and write novels, we must confront the question of where the boundary lies between human and machine creativity. If the value of intellectual labor, once a cornerstone, also disappears, what do we have left to cling to? The irony is that while technology is celebrated as a driver of productivity and prosperity, in this case, it can become an agent of social instability. The divide between those who benefit and those left behind could become the deepest crack of this century. And it is here that the AI threat is not just a technological risk, but a comprehensive megathreat. It can shake labor markets, disrupt social structures, create waves of inequality, and push politics in unpredictable directions. For years, people debated whether the world was truly entering a new Cold War-style confrontation. But now, that question is no longer relevant. In official U.S. government documents, in the National Security Strategy, the phrase, New Cold War, has appeared clearly. Unlike the confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, this time the battle line is not communist versus capitalist ideology, nor is the nuclear arms race central. The focus of the 21st century confrontation is economic and technological. The US and China have become two poles of power, and between them, an invisible wall is being built daily. On the trade front, the war has erupted, from tariffs and import restrictions to investment controls. But more importantly, the technology front, from 5G, artificial intelligence, semiconductors to clean energy, all have become weapons. Each side not only wants to gain an advantage, but also wants to prevent the other from accessing it. From this, decoupling becomes increasingly clear. Technology supply chains are split. Multinational corporations, which once built global networks, are now forced to choose sides. Any nation that doesn't choose early will be marginalized. This is not just an economic issue, it is deeply strategic. Whoever controls data, whoever produces advanced chips, whoever dominates green energy technology, that nation will hold power in this century. And both the US and China understand this. The result is that the entire world is drawn into the vortex. Europe wavers between the two poles, not wanting to lose ties with the US, but also unable to cut off China. Developing nations face pressure to choose sides. Investment, trade, ADOL are now tied to politics. The new Cold War is not as noisy as the old confrontation, but it permeates every corner. Students face travel restrictions, data is blocked at borders, tech companies are banned from operating in certain markets. Even movies and culture become tools of competition. The biggest risk is not a full-scale hot war, although the potential for regional conflict is ever present, but a long-term polarization where the world is divided into two blocks. Space for cooperation shrinks, and global problems like climate change, pandemics, and technology governance become almost impossible to solve due to a lack of trust and common mechanisms. And this is the essence of the new Cold War. It is not just bilateral competition between the US and China, but a process of redrawing the global economic and political map. It forces every nation, every company, every individual to position themselves in a polarized world. When this polarization combines with other megathreats, fragile finances, fragmented trade, technology causing inequality, the global system becomes even more brittle. And while humanity is preoccupied with confrontation, a silent, greater threat continues to grow: climate change, with the prospect of an uninhabitable planet. In scientific reports, the language is often clinical. Average temperatures rise by a few degrees, sea levels rise by tens of centimeters, ice melt rates exceed forecasts. But behind these numbers is a scenario that humans can hardly imagine: an uninhabitable planet. Climate change does not occur in a straight line. It has tipping points, thresholds beyond which the system cannot return to its previous state. The Amazon, once the world's green lung, could turn into an arid savanna. Ice in Greenland and Antarctica could melt so rapidly that sea levels rise by meters, submerging coastal cities. Ocean currents, which maintain stable climates, could reverse, making weather even more extreme. The consequences of these changes are not just worse weather, they involve climate migration on a colossal scale. Hundreds of millions, even billions of people could be forced to leave their homes due to floods, droughts, wildfires, and water shortages. And when these masses pour into safer lands, social and political conflict become inevitable. At the same time, agricultural production declines. Rising temperatures reduce the productivity of wheat, corn, and rice, major food sources. Droughts make many regions unfarmable, resulting in food shortages, rising prices, and widespread instability, especially in poor countries where people spend most of their income on food. Fresh water, once considered an abundant resource, becomes scarce. Rivers dry up, reservoirs empty, and permafrost no longer melts to provide summer water. Competition for water resources can trigger resource conflicts, turning already tense regions into flashpoints for war. And then there are diseases. A warming world paves the way for bacteria and viruses to migrate to areas where they previously did not exist. Malaria and dengue fever-carrying mosquitoes spread to higher latitudes. Pathogens hidden in permafrost could be released. The COVID pandemic was just a small reminder. In a chaotic climate environment, new pandemics will appear more frequently and ferociously. The bitter truth is that the only solution to this problem is international cooperation. But precisely when we need the greatest unity, the world is torn apart by geopolitical competition. The US and China, the two largest emitters, are holding each other back in a new Cold War. Europe is preoccupied with its energy crisis. Developing countries lack the capital and technology for a green transition. Climate conferences follow one after another. Promises for 2050, 2060. But even today, coal-fired power plants are still being built, forests are still being destroyed, and emissions are still rising. This is the paradox. We know the catastrophe is coming, but we act as if there is still plenty of time. Meanwhile, the climate clock continues to tick. Each year that passes without real action, the chance of keeping Earth within safe limits shrinks. Some wealthy individuals may seek refuge in high, temperate, resource-rich lands. They may build technological fortresses where life continues, but most of humanity will be left behind, trapped in uninhabitable regions. This injustice is not just moral, it is fuel for violence and chaos. The prospect of an uninhabitable planet is not science fiction. It is a realistic scenario if humanity continues on its current trajectory. And what makes it most dangerous is that it doesn't come alone. It connects with every other megathreat: finance, trade, technology, geopolitics to create a perfect storm. Perhaps what makes climate change the most dangerous megathreat is how it connects with and amplifies all the other threats. It's not just about temperatures rising by a few degrees or more rain than usual. It's the catalyst that makes every other crisis worse. When a currency meltdown occurs, vulnerable economies are often developing nations, and ironically, they are also the ones most severely impacted by climate. Agriculture accounts for a large portion of their output, infrastructure is weak, and finances are limited. A depreciating domestic currency, combined with failed harvests due to drought, can plunge an entire country into chaos. As globalization fragments global supply chains, climate risks further disrupt them. A typhoon in Southeast Asia can cripple the global electronics network. A drought in South America can make soybean, corn, and coffee supplies scarce, causing global prices to skyrocket. In a world divided into blocks, sharing resources to cope with climate disasters becomes exponentially more difficult. With AI, the risk is even more insidious. Technology can help forecast weather, optimize energy, and support sustainable agriculture. But if only a small group of nations or corporations own that technology, while the majority are left behind, inequality will worsen. Those with the tools survive, those without are eliminated. AI, in this scenario, doesn't mitigate climate impact, but exacerbates social division. Then there's the new Cold War. In a world that should unite against climate change, great powers instead use green energy and technology as weapons of competition. One side controls lithium batteries, another holds energy chips, one imposes carbon tariffs, while another opposes it for fear of losing trade advantage. Instead of cooperating, they turn climate into a new battlefield. And so, instead of reducing emissions, the world continues to chase after coal, oil, and gas to meet short-term needs. Instead of investing in renewable energy, governments prioritize economic stability during their terms. Pledges for 2050, 2060 are just distant promises, while in reality, emissions continue to rise annually. The biggest fear isn't isolated disasters, but tipping points irreversible thresholds. Once billions of tons of methane escape from Siberian permafrost, global warming will accelerate beyond control. Once the Amazon rainforest transforms into savanna, we lose one of the planet's largest carbon sinks. These tipping points are no longer distant warnings. Many scientists believe they have already begun. So, what is the scenario of an uninhabitable planet? It doesn't mean the entire Earth becomes a desert overnight. It means the most densely populated areas, coastal cities, fertile plains where billions live, will gradually become uninhabitable. Not everyone can move to high, cool, resource-rich regions. And when massive waves of climate migration begin, conflict will be inevitable. From this, we clearly see a spiral. Climate causes scarcity. Scarcity causes migration. Migration causes conflict. Conflict dissolves international cooperation. This dissolution makes climate even harder to control. That is the self-amplifying mechanism that makes an uninhabitable planet no longer a hypothesis, but a scenario that could become reality this century. If we look at each threat individually, we might still hope to control it. A currency meltdown might be prevented by foreign exchange reserves. A trade shock might be overcome by domestic policy. A technological advance might be balanced by retraining labor. But reality does not afford us such luxury, because these megathreats do not exist independently. They connect, supplement, and amplify each other. As confidence in the USD weakens, as the EMU cracks, as CBDCs and cryptocurrencies cause instability, economies become vulnerable. It is precisely then that globalization cuts off the global support network, turning local shocks into widespread disasters. In a fragmented world, every disruption from a rare chip to a staple grain becomes a weapon. Then, AI enters as a two-edged force. Instead of just bringing productivity, it also pushes millions out of the labor market. Increasing inequality turns into political instability. And in this context, the new Cold War tightens its grip, forcing nations to choose sides, reducing the space for cooperation. All converge in the greatest disaster: climate. If the world were still united, we could collectively reduce emissions, develop green technology, and reallocate resources. But in a polarized context, that becomes impossible. Each side views green technology as a weapon, each views energy sources as strategic assets. And so, instead of decelerating, we accelerate towards an uninhabitable planet. The world has witnessed debt crises, overcome wars, and survived pandemics. But this time is different because this time, all pillars are shaking simultaneously: financial instability, fragmented trade, technology causing division, geopolitical polarization, and uncontrollable climate. The question is no longer if, but when. When will a key currency collapse? When will a crucial supply chain break? When will AI exceed human control? When will the new Cold War turn into real conflict? And when will Earth cross irreversible tipping points? We no longer live in a stable world where crises are the exception. We are entering an era where crises are constant, where megathreats are no longer hypotheses but reality. If we don't acknowledge this, if we continue to act as if everything will eventually balance itself out, humanity will not be prepared. For once all these dangers explode simultaneously, we will not have another chance to correct our mistakes. Part 3. Can this disaster be avoided? Can all these megathreats surrounding us be prevented? The honest answer is not pleasant. Solutions exist, but they are complex, costly, fraught with political and geopolitical friction, and more importantly, the likelihood of achieving them is extremely fragile. To move from awareness to action, humanity must overcome barriers that history shows we frequently fail to surmount. I recall the Global Trends 2040 report published by the U.S. National Intelligence Council. It outlined 5 scenarios for the future world, and only one bore an optimistic tone: democracies. The other 4 scenarios, molestation, awan-arf, silos, along with other pessimistic variations, all emphasized instability, fragmentation, and crisis. From my perspective, these can be simplified into 2 paths. One is a dystopia, where one or more megathreats materialize and plunge the world into a spiral of decline. The second is a future I provisionally call Utopian, in quotes, where robust public policies, serious international coordination, and fundamental changes might help humanity partially avert catastrophe. First, let's imagine dystopia. One of the first shadows is the dark side of technology. Social media, once hailed as a connecting tool, now becomes a machine for creating echo chambers, where people only hear voices of their own side and are cut off from shared reality. Conspiracy theories spread, anger is encouraged, and violence is legitimized. Instead of uniting, technology becomes fertile ground for division. AI and machine learning are not just tools for production or creation. They become sophisticated tools for manipulating public opinion, where fake campaigns, misinformation, and disinformation can be amplified with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Furthermore, authoritarian regimes see AI as a servant of totalitarianism, a tool for surveillance, censorship, and social control on an unprecedented scale. If in the last century the state could control television and newspapers, now with AI, they can control the thoughts and behaviors of every individual. The second shadow is widespread unemployment due to automation. As machines replace not only manual labor, but also intellectual work, millions, even hundreds of millions, of people could be pushed out of the labor market. They lose jobs, income, and most importantly, dignity. This loss is not just numerical. It encompasses dissatisfaction, anger, and the risk of social unrest. The third shadow lies in geopolitics. The US and China are locked in a fierce struggle for technological and economic power. Whoever leads in AI will hold global strategic advantage. This confrontation reshapes all alliances, forcing other nations to choose sides. Simultaneously, the risk of asymmetric warfare increases. Cyber espionage, cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns targeting democracies. Along with this is the potential for hard conflicts, as seen in Ukraine or Taiwan. The prospect of dark destiny, a world where technology betrays its promise, where society is deeply stratified, where geopolitical tensions constantly escalate. And the most painful thing is that this path seems more realistic, more likely, because it aligns with what humanity has been doing. Procrastination, denial, and choosing short-term gains over long-term solutions. The shadow of the future doesn't stop at echo chambers or a few misinformation campaigns on social media. That's just the surface. Underneath is an entire new structure where technology is transformed into a tool of governance. Imagine a society where every behavior is monitored by an AI system, from facial expressions on the street, voices in calls, to shopping habits and searches. Everything is recorded, analyzed, and scored. This system doesn't just predict actions, but also shapes them. It rewards compliance, punishes dissent. People live in an invisible cage, where AI acts as a servant of totalitarianism. At that point, the dark side of technology is no longer a distant threat, but a daily reality. What were once tools for entertainment become invisible chains. Creativity, debate, resistance, the foundations of freedom are stifled by the very technology expected to liberate humanity. Concurrently, the crisis of widespread unemployment due to automation spreads to every corner. Not just factory workers or truck drivers, but lawyers, doctors, journalists, teachers. Jobs that once required intellect, skill, and qualifications can now also be replaced by AI. At that point, society faces not only high unemployment rates but also a collapse of faith. If even intellect cannot protect me, what can? Stratification becomes harsh. A small group of people who own technology and capital will become the victorious class, while the vast majority become losers. They don't just lose jobs, but also the sense of purpose in society. And from that uselessness, anger arises. History has witnessed waves of uprisings when injustice exceeded limits. This time, injustice could come from the very machines created to liberate humanity. On the international stage, the US and China enter a fiercer rivalry than ever before, no longer just trade or tariffs, but a race in AI and cutting-edge technology. Whoever masters data, whoever possesses supercomputing capabilities, whoever trains better algorithms will gain strategic advantage. This confrontation spreads beyond the borders of the two nations. Old alliances are restructured. Countries that once stood in the middle are forced to choose sides. Not choosing means isolation. The world gradually polarizes into two blocks, and between them is an increasingly deep chasm. At the same time, the risk of asymmetric warfare skyrockets. Instead of bullets and bombs, attackers use cyber means to cripple power grids, financial systems, and healthcare. Instead of tanks, they unleash misinformation campaigns to sow division within the enemy's society. And parallel to these insidious tactics are the risks of hard conflicts, like the war in Ukraine or the potential for escalating tensions around Taiwan. The picture of dark destiny is a world not only fractured but actively turning technology into an enemy. Technology, instead of paving the way for cooperation, becomes a weapon. Labor, instead of being protected, is replaced. Nations, instead of connecting, polarize. All converge on a trajectory heading straight for a future where dystopia is no longer literary fiction, but a gradually forming reality. A grim future is not formed by a single factor, but by the synergy. What is happening today are the slow pieces assembling into a dystopian vision. Let's start with technology. The dark side of technology isn't just social media manipulating public opinion or AI ML becoming surveillance tools. It also lies in technology being used to create new weapons. Misinformation campaigns can shake democracies, sowing doubt into every truth. Cyberattack tools can bring down a city's entire power grid, paralyze hospitals, and disrupt financial networks. And when these tools are used in the context of asymmetric warfare, the consequence is not just a few hours of disruption, but potentially the collapse of an entire society. But technology isn't just a weapon, it's also a wall. Some nations use AI to create digital superprisons where every individual is monitored. Facial recognition, voice recognition, behavioral analysis systems, combined with massive data networks, allow the state to control to an unprecedented degree. Personal freedom, once considered a core value, is gradually replaced by subservience. In that world, people are no longer citizens, but merely subjects whose behavior is analyzed and adjusted. On the socioeconomic front, widespread unemployment creates a dangerous void. Those who lose their jobs not only lose income, but also their sense of belonging. Society divides into two classes, a small class holding technological power and a large class left behind. This is no longer an equality as we once knew it, but a new form of classification, the valuable and the useless. Such polarization can lead to violent reactions. Anger is exploited by extremist political forces. Conspiracy theories and propaganda become tools for mobilization, turning despair into movements. When millions feel excluded from the system, they easily cling to simple promises, even if those promises are unrealistic. As a result, democracies are shaken from within, while authoritarian regimes are strengthened by technological tools of control. On the geopolitical front, the confrontation between the US and China is not just competition, but a complete restructuring of the world order. Alliances shift. International relations polarize. Nations that don't choose sides will be isolated, losing access to technology, capital, and markets. And when the world is divided in two, global problems from climate and pandemics to cybersecurity are no longer addressed. Instead of cooperating, each side looks out for itself and all suffer the losses. Added to this is the risk of hard conflict. Ukraine has proven that war in Europe is still possible. Taiwan is a flashpoint that could erupt at any moment. These wars are not just territorial disputes, but symbols of a power struggle. If one side loses, the balance will tip heavily towards the other, and that is something no one will accept. In the dark destiny, picture technology becomes a tool of oppression, labor is replaced, society stratifies, democracy falters, alliances restructure, and wars escalate. It is a world where what was once considered progress becomes the source of decline. This path is not a distant hypothesis. It is the logical outcome of current trends. If humanity continues to deny, procrastinate, and prioritize short-term interests over long-term solutions, dystopia is not just a possibility. It is destiny. If the path to dystopia seems more convincing and easier to imagine, the utopian scenario is like a difficult journey where every step encounters obstacles. But fragile as it is, it still exists. It is humanity's only path if we want to avoid total tragedy. First, it must be acknowledged that we cannot rely solely on the invisible hand of the market. Those who believe in market signals think businesses, consumers, and investors will self-adjust to avoid crises. But in reality, that rarely happens. Market failures are too significant to rely on self-correction. Without strong public policies and international coordination, these failures will accumulate and erupt. Many rely on ESG standards, environmental, social, governance as a solution. But I warn that too many of these fall into greenwashing or greenwishing, meaning that instead of creating real change, they become slogans and marketing tools. This is not enough. ESG can support, but it can never replace the role of the state in regulating markets. To see this more clearly, recall COP26 in Glasgow. It was a moment when the world seemed to agree. Leaders stood on stage, promising to cut emissions, promising to keep Earth within safe limits. But after the promises, harsh reality set in. The current trajectory of global emissions still points towards a 2.7 deg-C increase, much higher than the 1.5 deg-C target. The gap between commitment and action has never been wider. In fact, many countries set targets for 2050 or 2060, but lack concrete plans to make them a reality. Some even continue to expand coal and oil and gas exploitation. Thus, the utopian scenario not only demands vision, but demands immediate action, not distant promises. In my logic, to follow this path requires two elements: domestic policy reform and deep international coordination. At the national level, this means governments must boldly impose regulations, carbon taxes, and invest heavily in green technology, education, and social welfare. At the international level, it means overcoming geopolitical competition, building genuine cooperation mechanisms instead of mere slogans. The utopian scenario is not sweet. It is fraught with difficulties. But at least it opens a small window of opportunity to avoid the outcome of dark destiny. And it is here that humanity must face the crucial question. Do we dare to choose the harder, more costly, but only path that can save the future? The path to a utopian future sounds plausible but is incredibly difficult to implement, for it demands what humanity often lacks most: political consensus and collective action. Every nation is torn by short-term interests. A politician knows that imposing carbon taxes or restricting fossil fuel extraction will reduce growth, increase energy prices, and could cost them re-election. So, even knowing what needs to be done, they often choose to delay, pushing the responsibility to the next generation. But climate and the megathreats do not wait. They continue to accumulate daily. Another obstacle is the asymmetry in capabilities. Rich countries can invest hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy, climate-resilient infrastructure, and safe AI research. Poor countries cannot. They still depend on cheap coal, oil, and gas to maintain development. They want to participate in the green transition but lack capital and technology. Without international cooperation to bridge this gap, this disparity will turn into global injustice. This is why many poor countries accuse rich countries of hypocrisy, simultaneously calling for emission reductions while continuing to consume vast amounts of energy, simultaneously promising aid while not transferring sufficient capital and technology. Global trust is eroded, and this often causes cooperative efforts to collapse. Furthermore, there is the risk of collective illusion. Humans tend to believe there is still plenty of time, that if it's not done today, it can be done tomorrow, that future technology will solve the problem itself. This complacency is fueled by greenwashing and greenwishing, glitzy reports, and empty green promises about concrete action. Meanwhile, reality becomes increasingly harsh. Scientists warn that we are approaching a climate singularity, a tipping point where the climate system crosses a threshold and self-accelerates its destruction. At that point, all subsequent efforts, no matter how drastic, will only be palliative. What are the consequences of procrastination? A series of tipping points begin to manifest. Melting ice, forests losing their carbon absorption capacity, acidifying oceans, collapsing ecosystems. When these tipping points synergize, they can create an irreversible spiral. The extreme scenario is the collapse of global supply chains due to relentless natural disasters, the evaporation of wealth accumulated over generations, and massive waves of migrants crossing borders in search of new homes. And all this is no longer a distant hypothesis, but a clear and present danger if we continue to act as we are, ignoring the right people, denying evidence, and not allocating sufficient resources for action. The utopian path, therefore, is not a beautiful dream. It is a harsh test. It demands fundamental changes in how governments operate, in how businesses define responsibility, and in how people accept sacrifice for the common future. If humanity is courageous enough to follow this difficult path, utopia is not paradise, but a temporary escape from tragedy. It requires strong public policies and genuine international cooperation. The first is a change in approach to climate. Instead of merely making distant commitments, governments must implement immediate emission reductions. This means carbon prices must accurately reflect environmental costs, green technologies must receive massive investment, and polluting industries must be transformed or eliminated. This is uncomfortable but necessary. Second is reforming the financial system. For poorer countries to participate in the transition, global capital flows must shift from north to south, from rich to poor. Otherwise, inequality will make them refuse to cooperate. A global climate fund has been promised but rarely fully delivered. A utopian scenario demands serious implementation, not just declarations. Third is technology governance. AI can become a rescue tool if properly controlled. It can help forecast climate, optimize energy, and increase agricultural productivity. But to do so, global regulations are needed to prevent technology from becoming a servant of totalitarianism. International agreements similar to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty are needed, but applied to artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Fourth is restoring international trust. A utopian future can only take shape if nations overcome the spiral of suspicion from the new Cold War. This requires sustainable dialogue channels, cooperation mechanisms for climate, pandemics, and cybersecurity. Without trust, all agreements are fragile. This path clearly demands many sacrifices. It forces people to accept higher prices for clean energy, to invest more in healthcare, education, and green infrastructure. It forces businesses to forego easy profits based on environmental destruction. It forces politicians to face the risk of losing votes to pursue long-term interests. This is why I put utopian in quotation marks, because it is not a paradise in the true sense. It is merely a less terrible scenario, a harsh but necessary choice to avoid dark destiny. But this vision is still possible if humanity learns one thing: that catastrophe is no longer a distant risk, but a rapidly approaching reality. With each year of delay, the gap between commitment and action widens, and the probability of falling into dystopia increases. Utopian is not complete salvation, but merely an opportunity to avoid the worst-case scenario. And that opportunity, if not seized now, will be lost forever. Arc destiny, or a utopian future, there is no third path. I call this the ultimate choice. In the grim scenario, technology becomes a tool of oppression. AI transforms into a surveillance instrument. Misinformation shatters trust. Widespread unemployment breaks social structures. And asymmetric warfare and hard conflicts reshape geopolitics. That is the dark destiny we are approaching. In the opposing scenario, the world chooses strong public policies against greenwashing and greenwishing. It fulfills climate commitments with real action, reforms finance to support vulnerable nations, controls technology to prevent it from becoming a servant of totalitarianism, and rebuilds international trust even amidst a new Cold War. Both paths are arduous, but the difference is that the first path almost certainly leads to collapse, while the second, difficult and costly, still leaves open a chance for survival. The problem is not whether humanity knows. We do know. Scientists have warned about tipping points. Reports have shown that we are heading towards 7 Deg C instead of 5 Deg C. Experts have analyzed the dangers of climate singularity, of out-of-control technology, of megathreats. All the evidence has been laid out. The problem lies in whether we have the courage to act, the courage to accept costs today to save the future, the courage to overcome local interests and political terms to strive for the common good, the courage to change our trajectory before it's too late. I have no illusion that the utopian path will be easy, nor do I believe that everything will become perfect. But I know one thing: if we do not embark on that path, we will slide faster into darkness. The price of delay is not just a few percentage points of growth, a few $billion in aid, or a few political commitments. That price is the entire future of humanity. Even in the gloomiest picture, there is still a ray of light. That ray is narrow but still present, and our responsibility, those of us living in this decisive moment, is not to let that ray close. It's not a forecast, not science fiction, but a choice: dark destiny or utopian. That choice is not for a few leaders, but for all of us, and we must choose now.